This is John from Polymath Producer, and today I have a classic music production analysis for you. We're doing Frank Sinatra's Fly Me to the Moon, produced by Sonny Burke and arranged by Quincy Jones. Now, the reason why I wanted to really get in deep with this track was because we've already analyzed a Quincy Jones track from the 80s, and this track took place 20 years earlier. Now, this track sounds a lot different to Quincy Jones's 80s stuff. I mean, the stuff in the 80s for MJ sounds very unique to MJ. The stuff in the 60s sounds very unique to Frank Sinatra. So how has Quincy Jones been able to transcend genre through that 20-year period and create such an identity for the artists that he works with? Well, it's my opinion that it's because his understanding of the fundamentals is on a level that's very, very deep. That's how he's been able to transcend genre and eras and stay relevant for so long. When it comes to arranging tracks, because he was the arranger of this track, when it comes to arranging tracks, especially in this style of music, like this Frank Sinatra style, I'm pretty sure that the way that they go about it, I'm not 100% on this, but I'm 99% certain. This is the way they think about arranging when it comes to these classic songs, like Fly Me to the Moon. What they do is they get something called a lead sheet. And a lead sheet is basically the most simple version of a popular song written on sheet music. So, for example, in Fly Me to the Moon, it'll just be Fly Me to the Moon, its vocal melody written down in sheet music form in its most simple form. It'll have the lyrics just below it. It'll have the chord progression that the songwriter wrote, and it'll have the time signature that the songwriter wrote it in. And that will all just be laid out in its most simple form. Now, the arranger comes to the lead sheet, and it's their responsibility to, change the key, to put it in the key of what the artist wants. They change the singer can change the melody to suit like how they want it, like as long as it stays the same as what the songwriter wrote, but they can do their own interpretation of the melody and lyrics. But the arranger's main responsibility is to grab the chord progression, the time signature, and sometimes even change the time signature, but they grab the core elements of the song itself. And then with those core elements, they then arrange the accompaniment material from that. So, for example, in this track, the brass section, a lot of the melodies that the brass section is playing is basically melodies from the lead sheet, from the lead vocal, but repurposed in their own way. The purpose of an arranger is to, especially in this style of music, is to accentuate those points and also make it so that the arrangement is almost like a conversation with the vocalist. So the vocalist is doing the lead melody, and then the arrangement is having a conversation with itself, as well as accompanying the lead vocal as a secondary hook. Okay, now I'll get into more detail while we go through it, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to analyze this track, was because it's from that old school era. Okay, this is like 40s, 50s, 60s style. So we're going way back now. Now, if you want to learn the fundamentals yourself, I've put together a video called Read Songs Like a Book. You can find it on polymathproducer.com. I highly recommend you go check it out, because people who have gone through the Polymath Producer system after watching that video, their grasp of the fundamentals is next level. Like, they start to think like how Quincy Jones thinks, like as a big picture producer. So if you want to go check that out, I highly recommend it, polymathproducer.com. Okay, so the first instrument that I wanted to cover for this particular track in this arrangement is the guitar. Now, what I want you to notice with this guitar is that it's very straight rhythm. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's where the strums are happening on every beat. It's straight rhythm, and it happens through the whole track. This doesn't change, like the rhythm doesn't change. That's the start. That's midway through the track. 3/4 of the way through the track. Same rhythm. Literally the same rhythm. There's only 2 parts in the entire track where it slightly changes, and that's at the climactic moments of the track, and that's twice. Happens right at the very end, and it happens just at the end of this instrumental break. It's just held for a little bit longer, and then it goes back into itself. Why I wanted to really note this is because it is the core harmonic rhythmic driver of the track. For those who don't know what that is, core harmonic rhythmic driver is essentially the lead harmonic material that does the main rhythm of the song, and it flows with the core rhythm. Core rhythm is basically the kick and the snare, like the main beat, as well as the bass. So those flow as one, and then the core harmonic rhythmic driver flows with that. And this is present in pretty much every single track ever made. It's a weird phenomenon that I noticed after I analyzed like hundreds of tracks. Obviously the core harmonic rhythmic driver can play by itself and doesn't need the bass or the core rhythm. One or the other will be most likely playing at any given time, unless for very creative purposes. So this particular track, the guitar is the core harmonic rhythmic driver, but I want you to notice how harmonically varied it is. It's changing harmonies, like the chord progression is constantly changing. Constantly changing. Now with a lot of these old classic tracks and songs, the chord progressions are very complicated. If you want to learn how to do harmony well, look at the music from this era, from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 60s, like a lot of the Beatles stuff as well. The harmonies and chord progressions are very complex. So if you want to learn music theory, go to those eras and look at that music and reverse engineer that music, because that's where you learn like how things really work. This is the core harmonic rhythmic driver. It's outlining the core harmonic structure. Okay, so you've got the core structure principle, which is number one, outlines the structure of the song, the form of the song. Core harmonic structure outlines the chord progression which takes place within that structure. This guitar is taking you through that harmonic structure, and it's very straight rhythm. Now, the thing that I was fascinated about was because when you listen to these songs from this era, it's got that sort of swing to it where you groove with it, and I never realized that comes from the fact that there's a straight rhythm in the background. So let me explain a little bit further. When it comes to groove, a lot of the time contrast is what works. So if you have a straight rhythm and it's got a syncopated rhythm that's a counter rhythm, then that conflict will create the groove. If you've got a syncopated rhythm and then you've got straight rhythms above that, that will create healthy conflict. Now, you don't necessarily have to have this all the time, but I just noticed for this particular track, it's got a very straight rhythm, which allows Frank Sinatra to do his thing in the vocals because it's swung. So the way he sings it is very like laid back and chill. That's why it sounds like, that's why Frank Sinatra has that unique vibe about him, because he's constantly sounding like he's just laid back, chill, sort of singing it as he's singing it.
Let me see what spring is like on the Jupiter and Mars.
See how the contrast there, like it's straight rhythm, and then he's doing like he's sort of moving like this. Like it's almost like that. His groove, like his voice is the groove. It's weird. It's crazy.
Fly me to the moon.
Like see how just
let
those
me play among the stars.
Just with that contrast, you're grooving.
Let me see what spring is like on the Jupiter and Mars.
Like he's making you groove with just his voice, and that's phenomenal. Like that's crazy that he can actually do that. So the reason why that works though is because he's got that contrast, that straight rhythm, that contrast. So the principle to really understand here is that the core harmonic rhythmic driver will have contrast to it. So whether it's straight rhythm, usually syncopated rhythms work well with it. If it's a syncopated rhythm, then usually straight rhythms will work in contrast with it. So you got to look at the ways that things are interacting with each other like that. Now, if you have a look at the bass instrument, this is the core rhythm. It's flowing with the core harmonic rhythmic driver. Have a listen. See how they're flowing with each other. So they're playing the same rhythm. The bass line is what is played by a double bass, I believe, and it's what you would call a walking bass line. So it sounds like it's constantly moving. It's just constantly moving. It's constantly walking bass line. It's an old school tool that's used in a lot of those, a lot of the songs from this era, like jazz and all that. Like it's like you're just walking around like with the bass. So the walking bass line really, I guess it's designed in this way because you can move through such harmonic variety in a way that's in a straight rhythm like this. That's why they've done that. So he's got this core rhythm backdrop for the track that is very straight. So I'll put it with the drums as well. And then it's just kick, snare on the 2 and 4. Very straight rhythm. Yeah. So I was blown away when I realized this, because I was like, oh, it's such a straight rhythm, but Frank Sinatra makes his vocals so like laid back on the beat that it makes it sound groovy. Like it's amazing.
Long for all I worship and
that's what gives it that swing, that groove.
In other words.
Now the other main instrument in this is the brass section, and it's funny to note this because the bass, the drums, and the guitar play straight rhythm. The vocals and the brass are where it's syncopated, where it's sort of lazy on the beat, where it's swung, and the contrast is where the magic happens.
Fill my heart with
See, the brass is...
Let me sing forevermore.
The brass is off, like slightly off time. I don't mean off time in a bad way, I mean it's slightly off the beat. Have a listen. It's swung. It gives it that like you can't help but groove to it. So it's not even the beat. It's not even the beat that is causing you to groove. Well, it's the beat, but it's the contrast between the straight beat and the groovy swung instruments and vocals, which is just absolutely incredible. So I should probably note that there is a piano in this track, but it only takes place in the intro and the outro. So this is what I would call like a featured instrument. It comes in once or twice in the entire track and then disappears and you never see it again. So this is what it does. That's in the intro. I'll play it with the other instruments. And then at the very end, it plays this. I'll play it with the song.
Fly me.
And this is the ending. Okay, so why does the featured instrument work in this case? Like, why has he only put the piano in 2 parts of the entire track, the intro and the outro? When you have an instrument like this and you make it so simplified, like this, the intro, he's only playing like 2 notes. And it features once and it doesn't happen for the rest of the song until the very end. So why does this work so well? He's used it in such a simple way that it's become almost iconic. Like when you hear those opening 2 notes of the piano, you know exactly what song it's going to be. And that's what you can do with featured instruments. That's the purpose of them, really, is you make them enter at a moment where you want to give the track some identity. That's really what it's about. It's grabbing an element that's unique because it only happens a few times in the whole track, so it surprises the audience when they hear it. And in this case, it's the piano. 2 notes, and it's just like, boom, this is what the track is. And at the very end, what that is like a little fill in between the vocal lines. So it's a nice little addition to the track just to like add a bit of flavor. So the principle you want to understand here is how can you use a featured instrument in your track that features only like once or twice, but creates like an iconic element to your track, something that gives it that identity that doesn't happen for like the whole track, but only happens on key moments. Now the flute in this track only happens in the first section, so the first verse, and then it happens a little bit near like in the instrumental breakdown. So this is in the first verse.
And Jupiter and Mars. In other words, hold my hand.
hear how
In other words,
coming in?
Darling, kiss me.
Okay, so the purpose of the flute in this track is to really do responses to the vocal's call. So the vocal is doing melodic phrases, and then the flute is doing a response to the vocal's call.
Moon, let me play among the stars. Let me see.
Can you hear how Sinatra's doing a vocal phrase, and then the flute will do a response to that phrase? The flute line, as I was saying at the very start of this video, is almost like a repurposed version of what the vocal melody is. So he's basically grabbed the lead sheet, like the bass, the core melody that exists, and then he's making little variations on that melody as responses, instrumental responses to the vocal's call.
Fly me to the moon. Let me play among the stars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, darling.
It's almost like the flute is responding. It's responding to the call. It's like a conversation that's happening. Now, the other thing to note about the flute is that it's a very light textured element. When it comes to orchestration, the lighter elements or the lighter instruments a lot of the time come on the lighter passages. And then as the track progresses and becomes more dense, the orchestrator will use more dense elements in the arrangement. It's the same principle that applies to classical music as well. If you can hear, the brass section comes in when the drums come in and as the arrangement progresses. So the flutes in this light section. In other words,
darling, kiss me.
Now the brass takes over.
Fill my heart with song. Let me sing.
And the flute drops out for pretty much the rest of the track. It only comes in one more time as a little featured instrument, and then it disappears. That is the reason why he's done the flute at the start, is because it's a lighter texture. And at the start, you want the song to be, well, he wanted the song to be a bit more lighter.
To the moon. Let me
There's no brass in this section.
Among the stars. Let me see what spring is.
He's really just introducing the core elements in this part, and then he progresses the energy as the track continues by entering the brass into it. What you really want to remember with this is that the flute and the brass, they really contrast with each other with energy over time. So flute for the lighter sections, and it's higher as well. Brass for the more dense textured sections, when he wanted more impact. And you can do the same thing with any instrument, synths, whatever. Like if you want a verse to be a bit lighter in feeling and energy, use lighter sounding synths. And then for the drops and things, use more dense layering for that. Same principles apply over every era, any genre. So the core rhythm in the drum I found interesting because it's got that feel, that like that sort of feel. In the first sort of section before like the main like 2/4 snare comes in, like on beat 2 and 4, it's actually doing more of like a syncopated sort of thing. And it's on a hand drum, sounds like. Or maybe like a light snare tap or something like that. And it's very interesting. On the build up towards the main drum section coming in, the kick happens on the 2 and the 4. I thought that was fascinating because it emphasizes the beat in a backwards way, like it's inverted before the main drum comes in. Have a listen to it with the rest of the song.
Spring is like on Jupiter and Mars. In other words,
kick's hitting on the 2 and 4.
Darling, kiss me.
And then it goes to the 1 and 3, more straight. And that changes the feel completely. Like in this section, it's more
Mars. In other words,
accentuating the 2 and the 4 with the kick.
In other words,
gives that real sweet feel.
Darling, kiss me.
think that's fascinating to note that the difference between these type of drums and modern drums is that obviously these are real. So there's a real player who is playing it. So the intensity and the variation of intensity and energy in the track really comes in the player's choice of where he hits, why he hits, and how hard he hits. So if you'll notice in the snare, he starts with like, I don't know, either light taps or actually hand taps, and then he moves to like rim taps, so tapping the stick on the rim of the snare, and then he switches to full hits when he wants like real impact. When he has those big snare rises, he'll be hitting full, and then he automates it, volume automates it, or he crescendos it up himself. So the energy that he's playing is what's making it go louder, not a computer. So you gotta keep that in mind. But the same principle applies in modern day. How can you do that same humanization with sample-based things? I thought that was fascinating to notice how the drummer has used the different ways of playing to accentuate certain points. I'll keep listening to it. So he's hitting the rim. Goes to full. Instrumental break. He's still hitting the full. Goes a little bit lighter, and then he goes back to tap. So he's decreasing the energy. Notice how the energy decreases. It rises with the full hits. Crush. He's got the in the hi-hats, so the rhythm from the intro / the like first section, the first verse, that he was playing with like the sort of like a hand drum, that's coming in on the hats now, and the hit. The kick's coming in a bit more active now. So the kick flip technique is what I call it, like where it moves from more of a straight kick. So it started on the 2 and 4 for this track, then it went to 1 and 3, and now it's doing like a doom, 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 doom sort of kick. So there's an offbeat part of it. It's more active though. And then he pulls it back a bit. So he pulls it back a bit as the instrumental breakdown happens. He's pulling the energy back by decreasing the kick amount, decreasing the intensity of his snare hits, decreasing the intensity of how many hats are playing, and all of this is really, it can be transferred to a modern way of thinking. It's like, how can I decrease energy? By decreasing intensity of elements, intensity of volume of elements, intensity of how many elements there are, when they actually occur. When does it make sense for these elements to occur in the track in an interdependent way? He's decreased it down to a tap down. Still on the tap. He's starting to do a few offbeat kicks now, just to boom. This is really amazing, this section here with this breakdown. So he's playing so good. How's that? For the peak moment, it's where the drummer just like really goes all out. He's got way more kicks, way more intensity of the kicks, way harder hits, and it's happening congruently. So it's working with the other instruments, like play it with the brass. Hitting with it. Can you hear how the snare hits are actually flowing with the brass rhythm as well? So the brass and the drums are flowing as one entity. It's working together. The way that they've handled the drums in this era is that they've had to really deal with what they've got. And what I mean by that is that it's only the drummer playing. They don't have the opportunity to put samples in and layer the drums with different samples and all this stuff. So the old school way of doing things in this particular track was to use what the drummer has and really try to create energetic variety and variation from that. So how can you use just the kit, like just the drum kit, but create as much variety and energetic intensity as possible at the given times? So for example, in the high impact sections, he's using the full snare hit. In the sections where he wants to back off the energy, he brings it down to just a snare rim tap. For the sections, for the start section, it was just like a light tap with either the hands or the sticks. You know, the intensity of the kick as well, the way that the kick is hit, which beat the kick is hit on. Also in the high impact section, like whenever there's more high impact sections, the kick is more prominent as well. There's more offbeat hits on high impact sections, it seems. So all these small, very subtle details can make all the difference. And they're doing all of this, they're achieving all of this with just a standard drum kit, which is amazing. So how can you think about this in your own productions? Like, how does this parallel with modern day? Well, in modern day, you've got unlimited amount of samples that you could use. So say you start the track with just clicks, like just one click sample like that. And that sort of creates more of a lighter section. For the lighter sections, it's just the clicks. But then in the finale, you're layering with like all these different claps, all these different snares for these certain hits. Maybe you've got offbeat hits with like orchestra drums. You've got all these different samples. So there's a lot you can do with it. But the mindset remains the same. The energetic mindset remains the same. You're using energy in a way where you're layering samples so that they're more intense. So rather than hitting them harder, which you can do, like you can automate it, volume automation. But in modern tracks, a lot of the time, the way to do it is to create more layers so that with the hits, so that it creates more energetic intensity and texture that way. And then obviously add them more prominently, sort of like what the kick drum did in this track. So that's how you can relate this mindset to modern day and think of it that way. But this is a very minimalistic setup. How can you actually achieve that in modern day? How can you do that yourself without having to use all these different samples? Can you actually just use more of a minimalistic approach to it? Like, do you have to use like all these samples for energetic intensity? Sometimes you do, but not all the time. It's up to you to decide, what does this track that I'm doing, this track at hand, what does this need at any given time? That's always the question that you need to be asking yourself. So the final instrument I want to cover is the brass. The brass in this section, as I said earlier, is really the counter rhythm along with the vocals. So it's like the brass and the vocals are pretty much doing their thing, and then the straight beat in the background is creating that contrast. So there's this healthy conflict there. So the brass comes in as an accompaniment to the flute. If you can hear that, it actually doubles the flute line, but an octave lower. Very cool. So that's how it's actually entered into the song. So it connects onto the flute, which is awesome. And if you can also notice, the brass is repurposing the lead vocal line. So again, the lead sheet, so I'm talking about arrangers from this era, that's the way I'm pretty sure that they thought about the craft. Like the arrangers from this era grabbed the lead sheet or the lead vocal line and then repurposed the melodies. Have a listen to this brass. So the line before that is, in other words.
In other words.
In other words, in other words. It's almost like they're singing, in other words, just in different melodies.
Darling, kiss me.
Now, Sforzando. We talked about this in Mark Ronson's track in Rehab. Sforzando to enter into a section. So he's used sustained brass, Sforzando. I'll cover the key 3 again if you haven't seen the Mark Ronson one. In arrangements like this, and in all arrangements really, and not just with brass but with all instruments, there's usually 3 key things that brass specifically is doing at any given time. 1, staccato. So when it hits staccato, it's usually for high impact sections like climaxes. Not all the time, but a lot of the time it is. Or to accentuate certain rhythms. Sustained, sforzando. That's usually when brass is played as a pad, so it's like a pad underneath other instruments, or it's used to build intensity in a sforzando way, but it's still a pad, like it still holds. And then the last one is motive. So brass playing motives that are more secondary hooks to the lead vocal, or call and response to the lead vocal. So that's the key three. And in this track, the brass is playing the key three consistently. And a lot of the time, it's actually playing all three key three at the same time. So I'll show you. Before the section comes in, it actually sustains and does a pad.
Fill my heart with song, let me sing forevermore.
So a lot just happened then. The vocal's singing the lead melody. The brass is doing a secondary melody that's playing underneath, and it's at the top, so have a listen.
With song, let me sing.
And it's really coming in between vocal phrases, so it's like a response to the vocal's call. But if you can listen very carefully, there's also a second brass section, so it's like a brass quartet probably. It's got the high level brass doing the melody, and then you've got the accompanying brass doing more harmonic counterpoint, and it's doing the other parts of the key three, which is sustain or staccato on to accentuate certain rhythms. So it does all of that in this space. Have a listen. Sustain, sforzando, a little bit of a motive, and then staccato hits on the rhythm. You hear that? Dun, dun, dun. That was the staccato, and then you've got the melody over the top. As that's going, there's other brass going dun, dun, dun. Like that's that staccato, accentuates rhythm, motive, call and response with the vocal. You hear that? It's almost a conversation in itself, but the purpose of the staccato is to accentuate the rhythm, and it's also to have that counterpoint there and the harmonic aspects. But the melody that the brass is playing is as a secondary hook to the vocal and a call and response. So it's filling in between the phrases. So it's moving in between the vocal phrases, and you'll notice this in a lot of Quincy Jones's 80s arrangements. There's a lot of this happening. Like he'll have brass or strings playing in between vocal phrases. A lot of MJ stuff has this in there. So he's taken these fundamentals that he's learnt from all these arranging these types of tracks from this era and bringing them into the 80s.
In other words, please be true.
So it's just big conversation. It really is. Like it's just repurposing and call and response. That's basically what it is. Like the principles of repurposing and call and response, that is what this is. This whole thing. If you listen there's a lot of counterpoint happening, and counterpoint is basically the movement of multiple, basically melodies, but in a way where it's harmonically relevant and makes sense. So they each have their own voices, so it sounds like there's 4 voices. If it's a brass quartet, there'll be 4 voices, and he's written it probably on sheet music as well. The different voices, voice leading, where the different voices are going, how they're outlining the chords, how they're playing rhythmically, how they're flowing with each other. It's quite advanced stuff when you get into it that way. A lot of people don't need to know that in depth to make good music. I want to note that. Like this is if you want to get like really hyper detailed in your arrangements, and if you want to create like brass sections that have multiple counterpoint moving parts, outlining chords and all that stuff. When you create chords with synths, you're basically doing the same thing, but a lot of the time with modern productions, it's a lot more simple. What he's done here is voice leading. Like it can be quite intense. All the brass is moving together as one. It's all flowing as together, but then sometimes it branches out and does its own thing. As you can notice there, it's like they're formed as one, but they're harmonizing, all doing the same rhythms at certain points. But then sometimes parts of the brass will go off and do staccato, others will do motives. It's very creative the way that he's sort of moved around it. Now this is the instrumental section. So as you can listen and hear, it's basically the lead sheet melody of what that would be. So he's playing an instrumental version of what the lead vocal was singing. So it's fly me to the moon, but he's doing so slight variation. See, repurposing, variations, just really being inventive with it. If he just did the would it be as impactful? I don't know. It could be cool, but for whatever reason, he's done it this way, to make it more, inventive. Flute comes in. So now the flute and the brass are actually taken. So the brass is the lead. That's the primary motive now. That's the primary hook. And the flute is now being a secondary hook and the response to that now. And it only comes in once and then disappears. Stylistic brass. I don't know what that stylistic thing is that does. Like it's the one where it goes down, like that sort of sounds like it coming down. Not sure what the exact name of that is, but he's using very brass specific stylistic things in his orchestration. And if you can notice there, in the instrumental section, the brass was playing the main melody, and now it's moved back to the secondary. That's why it's not as in the front, and the melody isn't conflicting with the lead vocal now. That's really genius. Listen to this. It's the melody line, but it's just done in a different way. Like, but he's doing it. Like, just listen to the vocals and the brass. Let me sing forevermore. Let me sing forevermore. And it's going, it's doing the same thing, but just differently, just slightly differently. And if you can hear as well, as the brass is doing a bit of a melody, it's also doing the staccato. And what do you know, in this section, it actually starts to double core harmonic rhythmic driver. Okay, this is where it's all coming together. Fill my heart with song. Let me sing for. But the interesting thing to note with the brass that's following the core harmonic rhythmic driver is that it's really lazy on the beat. So that's giving even more swing. Because if you just listen to the guitar, that's very straight on the beat, very straight. But then you put the brass underneath it that's flowing with it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's almost coming just before the second beat or something like that. Like it's really cool. So he's created this effect where it's like a bouncy effect. It's almost like sidechain. He's almost like using sidechain in like a classic song. So because it's giving that like that same effect as what sidechaining like an instrument would do. Like it's that sort of like offbeat sort of doop 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 doop. Quincy Jones was ahead of his time. He was doing it back in the 60s. Really giving that like groove. Interdependence right here. Interdependence. He's holding, he's sustaining a vocal, but then you've got chaos underneath him. Sustained note, so it's contrast. Sustained note, held, but underneath the instrumental's chaos. All the instruments play at the same time at the very end. U on the U. So he's using the stack, the instrument stack principle essentially, which is really cool. Just to top it off, just to really top it off. So that is all I have for you today with that particular track. I had a very good time doing this one. As always, learnt a lot about the way that Quincy Jones thinks about arranging and sort of the parallels between this and modern day and how it's all linking together. So I hope you enjoyed this analysis, and if you want further information about how you can read songs like a book yourself, start to think like the masters yourself, I highly recommend you go check out polymathproducer.com. I'll leave the link below. When you analyze like this yourself, the stuff sticks in your head like really deeply, so that you start to intuitively do it yourself behind the DAW. Like just me doing this is like, my skills are growing dramatically, because all music production is decision making. So I have all these decisions from all these masters, so when I go to create myself, it's just effortless, it's intuitive. And you can do the same thing, and I show you how to do that in the Polymath Producer system. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.